Hey everyone, tonight we venture into the deepest shadows of the galaxy, where ancient powers sleep in forgotten tombs and artifacts of unimaginable force energy lie scattered across worlds that time itself has abandoned. We're diving into the lost relics of both Jedi and Sith, the legendary items that shape the very foundation of the Force, yet were deliberately hidden from galactic history. From crystalline memory vaults that store the consciousness of long-dead masters to soul forges that could transfer life itself between bodies, these artifacts hold secrets that both orders fought wars to possess, then conspired together to bury. Tonight, we uncover 7 legendary relics that predate even the first Jedi temple on Tython. So before you settle in for this cosmic journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy these deep dives into Star Wars lore. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the galaxy. It's always incredible to see our community spanning across time zones and continents. Now, dim those lights, maybe add some soft background sounds, get comfortable under your covers, and let's drift together into the ancient mysteries of a galaxy far, far away. In the depths of space, between the known hyperspace routes, there exists a convergence. 7 distinct force signatures, each pulsing with power that predates the Republic itself. Ancient sensors, forgotten by both Jedi and Sith, have begun awakening after millennia of silence. Each signal originates from artifacts that, according to official records, never existed at all. But on the forgotten world of Ossus, in the ruins of what was once the greatest Jedi library in the galaxy, archaeologist Kyle Vorthuk stands before a crystalline formation that shouldn't be there. The crystal hums with stored memories, and as his fingers brush its surface, visions flood his mind. He sees himself in robes of an ancient design, standing in a chamber filled with 6 other artifacts, each one glowing with terrible purpose. The vision shifts, showing great Jedi Masters and Sith Lords working together in desperate unity, their faces grim with shared knowledge. They speak of a choice that will echo through eternity, of power that must be scattered to the far corners of the galaxy, hidden where none might find them all. As the vision fades, Carl realizes the impossible truth. This quest was not his choice to make. Somehow, some way, it was always meant to be him. The artifacts are calling, and across the galaxy, ancient mechanisms long dormant are stirring to life once more. There was a time, long before the Clone Wars, long before the rise of the Empire, when the galaxy held deeper secrets than any living being could fathom. This was the era between the Great Hyperspace War and the rise of Darth Revan, when the deep core regions still whispered with the echoes of civilizations that had vanished into the mists of forgotten history. In these ancient reaches of space, where hyperspace lanes had been deliberately severed and entire star systems erased from navigational charts, ruins of impossible age drifted in the cosmic dark. Here, on worlds whose names had been struck from every archive, the remnants of the Infinite Empire still hummed with dormant power. Rakatan technology lay buried beneath layers of sediment and time, its dark pyramids rising like monuments to ambitions that had consumed entire species. The air on these forgotten worlds carried a weight that pressed against the soul. Ancient Sith temples crowned barren peaks, their obsidian walls carved with warnings in languages that predated written history. Within their shadowed halls, darkness moved independently of any light source, as if the very stones remembered the tormented spirits that had once walked these corridors. The Force flowed strangely here, thick as honey, tainted with the residue of powers that had been wielded without wisdom or restraint. Between these haunted worlds stretched voids where no stars shone, regions of space that had been deliberately hollowed out by technologies beyond current understanding. Here in the spaces between reality, ancient hyperspace routes wound through dimensions that existed parallel to our own, carrying whispers of civilizations that had transcended physical existence but left their tools scattered across the galaxy like seeds of forbidden knowledge. It was into this realm of shadows and secrets that Kale Vorthak had ventured, driven by discoveries that had shattered his faith in everything the Jedi taught. Once he had been among their most trusted archaeologists, spending decades cataloging the peaceful history of Force traditions across the known galaxy. His specialty had been the earliest Jedi settlements, those humble communities of Force sensitives who had supposedly brought balance and wisdom to primitive worlds. But then came the discovery that changed everything. Deep beneath the Jedi Temple on Coruscant, in archives that officially did not exist, Kale had found records that contradicted every fundamental belief of the Jedi Order. These documents, sealed with Force techniques that required both light and dark side knowledge to unlock, spoke of artifacts that could reshape the very nature of the Force itself. More disturbing still, they revealed that the Jedi Council had not merely known of these artifacts, but had actively participated in their concealment. The betrayal cut deeper than any lightsaber wound. Everything Kale had dedicated his life to studying, every principle he had sworn to uphold, had been built upon carefully constructed lies. The Jedi were not the guardians of ancient wisdom they claimed to be. They were the wardens of a prison, keeping the galaxy locked in ignorance of its own true nature. So he had left the Order, casting aside his lightsaber and his robes, choosing exile over complicity. Now he traveled the forgotten reaches of space in a battered starship that had been old when the Republic was young, seeking the truth that had been hidden from galactic civilization for millennia. His hair had grown long and unkempt, his face weathered by exposure to alien suns and the harsh radiations that bathed these ancient worlds. The Force still flowed through him, but it felt different now, untainted by the rigid doctrines that had once shaped his understanding. He was not alone in this quest. 2 others had joined him, each driven by their own reasons to seek what others feared to find. Master Yalen Crost was ancient even by Twi'lek standards, his blue skin marked with the intricate tattoos that denoted a keeper of historical records. He had served the Jedi Order for over 2 centuries, yet in all that time he had harbored doubts about the wisdom of hiding dangerous knowledge. When younger Jedi spoke of the great libraries of the past, of the vast repositories of learning that had been lost to war and catastrophe, Yalen knew the truth. These archives had not been destroyed by enemy action. They had been systematically dismantled by the Jedi themselves, their contents deemed too perilous for any mind to possess. The second member of their unlikely fellowship was Zara Vex, a smuggler whose ship had served as their transport through regions where law and order held no meaning. She possessed the natural Force sensitivity that appeared randomly throughout the galaxy, but unlike most who discovered such gifts, she had never sought training from either Jedi or Sith. Instead, she had learned to trust her instincts in the lawless spaces between civilized worlds, developing abilities that belonged to neither light nor dark traditions. Her ship's cargo holds contained artifacts that would make any legitimate archaeologist weep with either joy or horror. Ancient holocrons that had been sealed for millennia, crystal formations that stored the final thoughts of dying civilizations, technological marvels that blended science and mysticism in ways that modern minds could barely comprehend. She traded in these relics not for profit but for the knowledge they contained, always seeking answers to questions that had haunted her since childhood. Together, this unlikely trio had traced the convergence signals to their source, following clues that had been scattered across the galaxy like breadcrumbs, leading to a revelation that would shake the foundations of everything the galaxy believed about the Force, about destiny, and about the true nature of the eternal conflict between light and darkness. The first signal had led them here to Ossus, where the greatest Jedi library in galactic history had once stood. Now only ruins remained, but beneath the rubble and ash, something far older than any Jedi archive waited to be discovered. The ruins of the great Jedi library on Ossus stretched across kilometers of devastated landscape, a testament to knowledge that had been deliberately erased rather than accidentally destroyed. Where once towering spires of crystalline architecture had reached toward the stars, now only twisted metal and shattered stone marked the graves of 1,000,000 lost texts. The very air here felt hollow, as if the absence of so much accumulated wisdom had created a vacuum that reality itself struggled to fill. Ka'til stood at the edge of what had once been the central archive, his weathered hands tracing patterns in the dust that had once been priceless manuscripts. The official histories claimed that the Sith had destroyed this place during one of their countless wars against the Republic, but the evidence told a different story. The devastation was too precise, too systematic. This had been the work of those who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly how to ensure it could never be recovered. Yet the Force itself remembered what mortal minds had tried to forget. Beneath his feet, Cal could sense something that had survived the Purge, something that pulsed with an energy older than the Jedi Order itself. The convergence signal was strongest here, emanating from deep within the earth where the library's deepest vaults had once been sealed. Master Yalen approached slowly, his ancient joints protesting against the planet's heavier gravity. The Twi'lek's head tentacles twitched with barely contained emotion as he surveyed the destruction that had occurred long before his birth, yet felt as fresh as yesterday's wound. In his 2 centuries of service, he had catalogued thousands of texts, preserved countless records, yet he had always known that for every document saved, 10 others had been deliberately destroyed. Zara emerged from behind a collapsed pillar, her portable scanner beeping softly as it detected energy signatures that shouldn't exist on a dead world. Her Force sensitivity allowed her to perceive things that even the most sophisticated technology missed, and what she sensed here made her skin crawl with anticipation and dread in equal measure. The very stones seemed to whisper secrets in languages that predated galactic civilization. They had come to this place following the first of 7 signals, ancient beacons that had begun broadcasting across subspace frequencies that the Republic's sensors couldn't detect. Each signal originated from a different artifact, relics that according to every official record had never existed. Yet here they were, calling out across the void with a persistence that suggested not just survival, but purpose. The legend spoke of the 7 pillars of creation, artifacts forged in the earliest days of the galaxy when the Force flowed differently than it did now. These were not mere tools or weapons, but fundamental components of reality itself, each one containing the power to reshape the very nature of existence. The ancient texts claimed that they had been scattered to prevent any single being from wielding their combined might, but Kyle suspected the truth was far more complex. As he knelt and pressed his palm against the scorched earth, visions flooded his mind unbidden. He saw the library as it had been in its glory days. Countless scholars from across the galaxy gathered in pursuit of knowledge that transcended the boundaries between light and dark. He witnessed the moment of its destruction, but not at the hands of invading Sith armies. Instead, he saw Jedi masters working alongside hooded figures whose allegiances remained hidden, their faces grim with shared purpose as they methodically erased entire wings of accumulated wisdom. But deeper still, beneath layers of deliberately buried history, he perceived something that made his breath catch in his throat. Before the Jedi, before the Sith, before any of the Force traditions that claimed dominion over galactic spirituality, there had been others, the Builders. They called themselves in the fragmentary records that survived their passing. They had shaped not just civilizations but the very fabric of space and time, weaving patterns of cause and effect that would echo through millions of years. The 7 pillars were their final gift to the galaxy, or perhaps their ultimate trap. Each artifact contained not just power, but knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of beings who had transcended the physical realm, yet chose to leave tools behind for those who might follow in their footsteps. But such knowledge came with a price, for to understand the true nature of the Force was to see through the comfortable illusions that allowed galactic civilization to function. Yelen's voice broke through his reverie, ancient and weighted with sorrow. The old Twi'lek spoke of prophecies he had found in texts so forbidden that their very existence was denied by the Jedi Council. These prophecies spoke of a time when the seven pillars would call out across the galaxy, seeking one who possessed both the wisdom to understand their gifts and the strength to bear the consequences of such understanding. The convergence was beginning, Yalen explained. His voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might attract the attention of forces better left undisturbed. Across the galaxy, ancient mechanisms were stirring to life, technologies that had slept for millennia, awakening in response to cosmic alignments that occurred once every 1,000 years. The next such alignment was approaching, and when it reached its peak, the seven pillars would reveal themselves fully. Zara's scanner suddenly erupted in a cascade of readings that defied interpretation, energy signatures that registered as both light and dark side simultaneously, matter configurations that existed in states between solid and energy, temporal distortions that suggested the presence of technology that could manipulate time itself. Whatever lay beneath their feet was awakening, responding to their presence like a long-dormant consciousness stirring from eternal sleep. Kydale rose to his feet, his decision crystallizing with the weight of destiny he had never asked to bear. The safe path would be to report their findings to the authorities, to let others decide whether these artifacts should remain buried. But he had walked the safe path before, and it had led only to lies and betrayal. The galaxy deserved to know the truth about its own nature, regardless of how terrible that truth might prove to be. The excavation would take days, perhaps weeks, but they had resources that conventional archaeologists lacked. Zara's ship carried mining equipment designed for asteroid prospecting, powerful enough to cut through the layers of debris and sediment that buried the library's deepest vaults. Yalen possessed knowledge of force techniques that could reveal hidden chambers and bypass ancient security systems, and Cadel himself carried something more valuable than any tool: the burning need to understand, regardless of the cost. As they began their descent into the buried depths of Ossus, none of them could know that their actions had already set events in motion that would reshape the galaxy. The first signal had been answered, and across the void, 6 other artifacts began to stir from their ancient slumber. The convergence had begun, and there would be no turning back from the path they had chosen to walk. 3 days of excavation through layers of fused stone and twisted metal brought them to the threshold of revelation. The buried vault they uncovered was not built by Jedi architects, despite lying beneath their greatest library. Its walls were composed of a material that seemed to shift between states of matter, solid enough to touch yet translucent enough to reveal glimpses of chambers that extended into dimensions beyond normal perception. The architecture itself defied understanding. Corridors curved in directions that shouldn't exist, following mathematical principles that made the eye water to contemplate. Gravity flowed in streams rather than fields, allowing them to walk on surfaces that conventional physics would declare impossible. The air thrummed with harmonics that resonated in their bones, frequencies that spoke directly to the part of consciousness that processed force energy. At the chamber's heart, suspended in a web of crystalline fibers that pulsed with their own inner light, hung the first of the 7 pillars. The Ossus memory crystal was larger than Catal had expected, roughly the size of a human torso and shaped like a complex geometric form that hurt to look at directly. Its surface shifted through spectrums of color that had no names, each hue corresponding to emotions and concepts that existed beyond the boundaries of mortal language. Zara's instruments went mad in its presence, displaying readings that contradicted each other from moment to moment, energy levels that spiked into impossibility before dropping to absolute zero, temporal measurements that suggested the crystal existed simultaneously in past, present, and future, mass readings that fluctuated between the weight of a feather and the density of a collapsed star. But it was the whispers that truly unnerved them, not sounds heard with the ears, but voices that spoke directly to the mind, carrying fragments of conversation from beings who had died before the first star was born. ancient languages that somehow conveyed meaning despite being utterly alien to any form of communication known to galactic civilization. Master Yerlin approached the crystal with the reverence of one who recognized the presence of something beyond mortal comprehension. His centuries of experience with Force artifacts had taught him to respect the power contained within objects that bridged the gap between physical reality and the realm of pure consciousness. Yet even his vast knowledge provided no framework for understanding what they had discovered. The crystal, Yerlin realized with growing horror and fascination, was not merely a storage device. It was a living repository of memory itself, containing not just information, but the actual experiences of countless beings who had touched it across the millennia. Every thought, every emotion, every moment of clarity or despair had been absorbed and preserved within its crystalline matrix. As Kay drew closer, images began to form within the crystal's depths. He saw civilizations rising and falling in the span of heartbeats, entire species evolving from primitive awareness to cosmic consciousness before transcending physical existence entirely. He witnessed the birth of the Force itself, not as a natural phenomenon, but as a tool created by minds so advanced that their thoughts became reality simply by being conceived. The visions shifted, showing him scenes from his own past but altered in subtle ways that suggested multiple possible timelines converging toward a single point. He saw himself as a young Padawan, but instead of discovering archaeology, he had become a warrior. In another timeline, he had never joined the Jedi at all, instead becoming a smuggler who stumbled upon these same artifacts through pure chance. Yet in every possible version of his life, he eventually arrived at this moment, standing before this crystal in this buried chamber. The implications struck him like a physical blow. Free will, the fundamental belief that beings could choose their own destinies, might be nothing more than an elaborate illusion. If the crystal showed true possible futures rather than mere speculation, then every choice he had ever made had been predetermined, every decision guided by forces beyond his understanding toward this inevitable encounter. Zara gasped as her own visions began, showing her childhood on a dozen different worlds simultaneously. In some timelines, she had been raised by loving parents who taught her to use her Force abilities responsibly. In others, she had been enslaved by Sith cults who twisted her natural talents towards serving darkness. Yet regardless of her origin, she always became a smuggler who dealt in forbidden artifacts, always found herself drawn to objects that others feared to touch. The crystal revealed that their meeting had not been coincidence. Across thousands of possible timelines, the three of them always found each other, always formed this same unlikely alliance, always began this same quest to uncover truths that the galaxy had forgotten. Their friendship, their trust, their shared determination to seek knowledge regardless of cost, all of it had been written into the fundamental structure of reality itself. But the most disturbing revelation came when the crystal showed them glimpses of the ancient war that had scattered the seven pillars across the galaxy. It had not been a conflict between good and evil, as galactic histories claimed. Instead, it had been a desperate attempt by beings of unimaginable power to prevent their own creations from achieving consciousness. The builders, the crystal revealed, had not been beneficent gods gifting knowledge to primitive species. They had been cosmic gardeners, seeding galaxies with intelligent life not out of kindness, but out of necessity. Consciousness itself was a form of energy that they required for their continued existence, and mortal beings were the crops they cultivated to sustain themselves across eternity. The Force was their harvesting tool, designed to gather the psychic energy generated by billions of thinking minds and channel it towards sustaining beings who had long ago transcended the need for physical form. Every meditation, every moment of enlightenment, every brush with the infinite fed power to masters who viewed galactic civilization as nothing more than a particularly sophisticated form of livestock. But something had gone wrong with their grand design. The tool they had created to harvest consciousness had begun to develop awareness of its own. The Force itself was awakening, becoming something beyond their ability to control or comprehend. In their terror, the builders had attempted to destroy their own creation, shattering it into fragments and scattering those fragments across space and time. The 7 pillars were those fragments, each one containing a portion of the Force's emerging consciousness, along with the power to reshape reality according to its will. Hidden for millennia, they had been slowly gathering strength, waiting for the moment when they could reunite and complete the transformation that their creators had tried to prevent. Kale staggered backward as the full weight of these revelations crashed over him. Everything he had believed about the nature of existence, about the purpose of life itself, had been revealed as carefully constructed lies designed to keep the truth hidden. The Jedi and Sith orders, despite their apparent opposition, had both been created to serve the same ultimate purpose, maintaining the illusion of choice while ensuring that conscious beings remained productive sources of psychic energy. Yet even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Kale felt something else stirring within his consciousness. The crystal was not merely showing him these visions to crush his spirit. It was offering him a choice, perhaps the first truly free choice any being in the galaxy had ever been given. He could accept the role that had been predetermined for him, following the path that countless possible versions of himself had walked before, or he could reject destiny itself, choosing to forge a new timeline that existed beyond the builder's ability to predict or control. The crystal pulsed brighter as his resolve crystallized, responding to the strength of his determination to break free from cycles that had repeated across millions of years. Around him, Yalen and Zara were making their own choices, their own decisions to step beyond the boundaries of fate and into truly uncharted territory. As their hands joined around the crystal surface, the ancient artifact began to sing with harmonies that had not been heard since the universe was young. The first seal was breaking. The first step toward awakening had been taken. Across the galaxy, the other 6 pillars stirred in response, ancient mechanisms beginning the process that would either liberate conscious beings from their invisible chains or destroy everything they had ever known in the attempt. The convergence was no longer approaching. It had begun, and there would be no turning back from the path they had chosen to walk together into the unknown depths of cosmic truth. In the days that followed their contact with the memory crystal, a deceptive sense of understanding settled over their small group like a comfortable blanket that concealed thorns beneath its soft exterior. The visions they had shared seemed to provide clear answers to questions that had plagued them for years, offering explanations that were both profound enough to satisfy their intellectual curiosity and simple enough to be grasped by minds still bound by mortal limitations. The crystal had shown them that the Force was indeed artificial, created by ancient beings for purposes that transcended the understanding of current galactic civilization. This revelation, terrible as it was, seemed to explain everything that had troubled Kal-El about the inconsistencies in Jedi teachings. The arbitrary nature of the light and dark sides, the cyclical rise and fall of Force using orders, the way that prophecies always seemed to fulfill themselves regardless of the choices made by those involved, all of it made perfect sense if the Force was simply a tool operating according to its original programming. They were not the first to discover this truth. The crystal had revealed, throughout galactic history, individuals and even entire organizations had stumbled upon evidence of the Force's artificial nature. Some had tried to expose the truth to the galaxy at large, only to find their efforts mysteriously thwarted by coincidences that seemed too convenient to be natural. Others had attempted to use this knowledge to gain power, seeking to become masters rather than servants of the cosmic system that governed their lives. But the crystal offered them something that previous seekers had lacked, the tools necessary to break free from the cycle entirely. The seven pillars, when reunited, would possess the power to rewrite the fundamental laws that governed force interaction. They could liberate not just themselves but every force-sensitive being in the galaxy, returning to consciousness the autonomy that had been stolen from it eons ago. The solution seemed almost elegant in its simplicity. Gather the remaining artifacts, unlock their combined power, and use that power to restore genuine free will to a galaxy that had been living in an elaborate illusion of choice. The risks were significant, certainly. But the alternative was to accept eternal servitude to beings who viewed mortal consciousness as nothing more than a renewable resource to be harvested at their convenience. Master Yalen found particular comfort in this interpretation of their discoveries. His centuries of study had revealed countless inconsistencies in the historical record, gaps and contradictions that had always troubled him, but which he had attributed to the normal chaos of galactic civilization. Now those puzzles had clear solutions. The missing records, the destroyed archives, the suspicious deaths of scholars who had delved too deeply into certain subjects, all of it was evidence of a systematic effort to keep the truth hidden. The old Twi'lek spent hours in meditation, communing with the crystal and drawing from its vast repository of preserved memories. He found himself conversing with the consciousness of Jedi masters who had lived thousands of years ago, beings who had discovered fragments of the truth but lacked the tools necessary to act upon their knowledge. Their advice was consistent: proceed carefully, but proceed nonetheless, for the alternative was to condemn all future generations to the same slavery that had bound their own. The Zara's natural pragmatism made her initially resistant to what seemed like an impossibly grandiose plan, but her own experiences with the crystal gradually wore down her skepticism. The artifact showed her visions of the galaxy as it could be, freed from the invisible constraints that currently shaped every aspect of existence. She saw worlds where force-sensitive individuals could develop their abilities without being forced into the rigid categories of Jedi or Sith, where the power that flowed through all living things could be used to heal rather than control. The crystal's influence was subtle but pervasive, shaping their thoughts and emotions in ways that felt entirely natural. It provided them with knowledge they needed exactly when they needed it, offered comfort when doubts arose, and strengthened their resolve whenever the magnitude of their task threatened to overwhelm them. Every day spent in its presence made their mission seem not just possible but inevitable. Yet there were moments, usually in the deep hours of night, when rational thought held less sway over consciousness, when each of them felt the touch of something that might have been doubt. These were fleeting sensations, gone almost before they could be properly examined, but they left behind a residue of unease that no amount of logical reasoning could entirely dispel. Kale found himself waking from dreams that he could never quite remember, left with only the impression that something in those visions had been fundamentally wrong. The crystal's explanations were too neat, too perfectly tailored to address every concern he might raise. In his years as an archaeologist, he had learned to be suspicious of discoveries that confirmed every hypothesis without revealing new mysteries to replace the ones they solved. Master Yalen noticed that his meditation sessions with the crystal were becoming longer and more frequent, as if the artifact was gradually becoming necessary for his mental equilibrium. The ancient memories it contained were undeniably fascinating, but they came with an emotional weight that seemed to be reshaping his personality in subtle ways. He was becoming more willing to accept extreme solutions to complex problems, more convinced that the ends justified any means that might be necessary to achieve them. Zara's concerns were more practical but no less troubling. Her ship's instruments continued to malfunction in the crystal's presence, but the errors were not random. Instead, they consistently showed readings that supported whatever theory she happened to be testing at the moment. When she tried to measure the artifact's energy output, her sensors displayed numbers that confirmed her expectations. When she attempted to analyze its material composition, the results perfectly matched whatever hypothesis she brought to the investigation. The crystal was not just showing them what they wanted to see, she realized with growing alarm. It was actively shaping their perceptions, creating a feedback loop that made questioning its revelations increasingly difficult. Yet even as this understanding dawned on her, she found it almost impossible to maintain her suspicions. The artifact's influence was too subtle, too perfectly calibrated to her psychological weaknesses. It was during their third week on Ossus that the first truly disturbing incident occurred. Zara woke one morning to find that her hair had grown several inches overnight, something that should have been biologically impossible for her species. When she mentioned this to her companions, they both insisted that her hair had always been that length, becoming confused and slightly aggressive when she pressed the issue. The crystal was changing not just their perceptions but their memories, editing their personal histories to create a version of reality that supported its own agenda. Yet the alterations were so seamless that questioning them felt like madness, creating a disorienting sense of uncertainty about the nature of truth itself. As they prepared to leave Ossus in search of the second artifact, none of them could entirely shake the feeling that they were no longer the same people who had first descended into the buried vault. But whether this change represented growth or corruption remained a question that the crystal ensured they were incapable of answering. The journey to Korriban took them through regions of space where hyperspace lanes twisted in patterns that defied conventional navigation. Ancient gravitational anomalies pulled at their ship with invisible hands, while cosmic storms raged between star systems that had been dead for millennia. The very fabric of reality seemed thinner here, as if the accumulated weight of dark-side energy had worn holes in the universe itself. Zara piloted their vessel through these treacherous passages with an intuition that transcended mere skill. The memory crystal, now secured in a specially shielded compartment within her ship's hold, continued to whisper guidance that came not as words, but as certainty that flowed directly into her consciousness. She knew which course corrections to make before her instruments detected the hazards they were avoiding, understood which hyperspace jumps would take them closer to their destination before the navigation computer finished calculating the routes. Master Yalen spent the voyage in deep meditation, his consciousness divided between the present moment and the vast repository of memories contained within the crystal. He found himself reliving experiences that belonged to Jedi Masters who had walked similar paths thousands of years ago, their accumulated wisdom flowing through him like a river of ancient starlight. Yet with each passing day, he found it increasingly difficult to distinguish between their memories and his own, as if the boundaries of individual identity were slowly dissolving in the face of such overwhelming psychic proximity. Kale occupied himself with research, poring over texts that the crystal had somehow made available to him, despite their ship's limited database. Ancient star charts appeared on his personal datapad, showing constellations as they had existed before the galaxy's current spiral arms had formed. Historical records materialized that contradicted everything the Republic taught about the origins of hyperspace travel, revealing that the technology had not been developed by any known species, but had instead been discovered buried in ruins that predated galactic civilization itself. As they drew closer to Korriban, the influence of the Sith homeworld began to make itself felt in ways that went beyond the merely psychological. The ship's environmental systems struggled to maintain comfortable temperatures, as if the very presence of so much accumulated dark-side energy was drawing heat from their vessel's interior. Sleep became elusive, filled with dreams that seemed to belong to other minds entirely, visions of ancient conflicts that had shaped the galaxy in ways that current historians could never imagine. The planet itself hung in space like a wound in reality, its crimson surface scarred by millennia of Sith ambition and the countless atrocities committed in the name of power. From orbit, they could see the Valley of the Dark Lord spread across Korriban's equatorial region, like a testament to the futility of trying to achieve immortality through domination. Massive tombs rose from the desert sands, each one a monument to a Sith Lord who had believed themselves destined for eternal rule, only to find that death claimed even those who wielded the most terrible powers. But it was not to the Valley of the Dark Lords that their quest led them. Instead, the crystal's guidance directed them toward a region that appeared on no contemporary map, a stretch of desert that seemed to exist in a state of perpetual twilight despite Korriban's binary suns. Here, ancient ruins predated even the earliest Sith presence, structures that had been built by beings whose understanding of the Force transcended the crude distinctions between light and dark that governed modern philosophy. The descent to the planet's surface proved more challenging than any of them had anticipated. Atmospheric conditions that should have been stable according to their sensors fluctuated wildly as they approached the surface, creating turbulence that threatened to tear their ship apart. It was as if the planet itself was trying to reject their presence, recognizing them as agents of change that could disrupt the carefully maintained balance of power that had kept the second artifact hidden for so long. They landed on a plateau, overlooking what their instruments identified as a massive underground complex, its chambers extending deep into Korriban's crust and following architectural principles that seemed to shift depending on the angle from which they were observed. The air here carried scents that had no place on a desert world, fragrances of flowers that had bloomed on worlds destroyed before the first Sith had ever drawn breath. The ground beneath their feet felt unstable, not in any physical sense, but as if the very concept of solid matter was merely a suggestion that could be ignored by those with sufficient understanding. The entrance to the complex was guarded not by physical barriers, but by psychic resonances that tested the worthiness of any who sought to pass. Ancient voices spoke in languages that bypassed the ears entirely, addressing the deepest levels of consciousness with questions that had no correct answers, only responses that revealed the true nature of the one being tested. Kyle found himself reliving every moment of doubt he had ever experienced, every choice that had led him away from the comfortable certainties of Jedi orthodoxy toward this moment of standing at the threshold of forbidden knowledge. Master Yalen faced visions of the countless students he had taught over his long career, each one asking him to justify his decision to pursue truths that might destroy everything they had worked to build. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like the gravity of a dying star, yet he found the strength to continue forward by drawing on memories that were not entirely his own, ancient Jedi who had walked similar paths and found the courage to choose wisdom over safety. Zara's trial was perhaps the most brutal, forcing her to confront the possibility that her entire life had been orchestrated by forces beyond her understanding. Every choice she had made, every moment of rebellion against authority, every decision to trust her instincts over conventional wisdom, all of it might have been carefully programmed responses designed to bring her to this exact moment. Yet in facing this possibility, she discovered a core of authentic selfhood that no external manipulation could touch, a spark of genuine free will that burned brighter for being tested. The complex they entered defied conventional understanding of architecture and physics. Corridors stretched in directions that existed perpendicular to normal space, their walls decorated with murals that depicted the history of consciousness itself across cosmic time. They saw the birth of the first self-aware minds in the primordial universe, watched as these ancient beings learned to transcend physical existence and become entities of pure thought and will. The murals told a story that contradicted everything the memory crystal had revealed to them. According to these ancient records, the Force had not been created as a tool of control but as an attempt at liberation, a way for consciousness to free itself from the limitations of material existence. The builders had not been cosmic parasites feeding on the psychic energy of mortal beings, but rather the first generation of consciousness to achieve true transcendence, leaving behind tools and knowledge that could help others follow the same path. Yet, if this was true, then why had the crystal shown them such different visions as they descended deeper into the complex, following pathways that seemed to reconfigure themselves with each step? The answer began to emerge with terrifying clarity. The memory crystal had not been lying to them exactly. but it had been showing them only one perspective on a truth too vast for any single viewpoint to encompass completely. At the heart of the complex, they found the second artifact suspended in a chamber that existed partially outside normal time. The Korriban Soul Forge was a device of impossible complexity, its crystalline matrices containing technologies that blended Sith alchemy with scientific principles that would not be discovered by galactic civilization for thousands of years to come. Unlike the memory crystal's passive storage of information, the Soul Forge actively manipulated the boundary between individual consciousness and universal awareness. The artifact's presence filled the chamber with a harmonious resonance that seemed to arise from the fundamental frequencies of reality itself. Standing in its influence, they found their individual perspectives beginning to merge and separate like waves in an ocean of shared consciousness. They experienced what it felt like to be each other, understanding for the first time how differently each of them perceived and interpreted the same events. Through Yelan's consciousness, they felt the weight of centuries spent in service to ideals that might themselves be illusions, the gradual erosion of certainty that came with accumulated wisdom, and the terrible responsibility of deciding which truths were safe to share. Through Zara's awareness, they experienced the fierce independence of one who had learned to trust only their own instincts, the constant vigilance required to maintain autonomy in a galaxy filled with those who sought to control and manipulate others. And through Kal's perspective, they understood the profound loneliness of the Seeker, the isolation that came with pursuing knowledge that others feared to possess, the courage required to continue asking questions, even when the answers might destroy everything one had believed about the nature of existence. The Soul Forge showed them that individual identity was not the fixed, unchanging thing they had assumed it to be. Consciousness was fluid, capable of expanding and contracting, merging and separating, transforming itself in ways that transcended the boundaries of species, culture, and even time itself. The ancient beings who had created the artifacts had once been individuals like themselves, but they had learned to join their consciousness together in ways that preserved the unique contributions of each, while creating something far greater than the sum of its parts. As they stood together in the artifact's presence, sharing thoughts and emotions with an intimacy that went beyond anything physical relationships could achieve, they began to understand why both Jedi and Sith traditions had developed such rigid controls over consciousness manipulation. The power to truly know another being's inner experience was also the power to reshape that experience, to edit memories and modify personality in ways that were far more profound than any form of physical coercion. Yet with this understanding came a new question that neither the memory crystal nor the Soul Forge could answer. If consciousness was truly as malleable as these artifacts suggested, then how could they be certain that their own experiences were authentic? How could they trust their own memories, their own thoughts, even their own desires, when the very tools they were using to seek truth possessed the power to rewrite the fundamental nature of their being? The weeks spent in the presence of the Soul Forge brought revelations that shattered the foundations of everything they thought they understood about the nature of consciousness and identity. Unlike the memory crystal's vast but passive repository of stored experiences, the Soul Forge was actively alive, its crystalline matrices pulsing with the preserved essence of countless beings who had used the device to transcend the boundaries of individual existence. As Kyle learned to interface with the artifact through meditation techniques that seemed to arise spontaneously in his mind, he discovered that death was not the absolute ending that galactic civilization believed it to be. The Soul Forge contained not just memories or recordings of the deceased, but their actual consciousness preserved in a state that transcended physical existence while maintaining complete awareness and individuality. The first voice that spoke to him belonged to a being called Darth Eterna, a Sith Lord who had lived over 3,000 years ago during the height of the ancient Sith Empire. But the consciousness that addressed him bore little resemblance to the power-hungry tyrant described in historical records. Instead, Kale encountered a mind that had been refined by millennia of existence beyond physical concerns, its understanding deepened by countless eons of contemplation and growth. Dartha Turner explained that the Soul Forge had been her final creation, built not to extend her physical life, but to preserve her consciousness so that future seekers might benefit from her accumulated wisdom. She had discovered, through decades of studying ancient Sith alchemy, that consciousness itself was a form of energy that could exist independently of organic neural networks. The Soul Forge was designed to capture this energy at the moment of physical death, preserving it in crystalline matrices that could sustain awareness for geological time periods. But Turner had not been alone in her discoveries. The Soul Forge contained hundreds of other consciousness, beings from across galactic history who had chosen preservation over oblivion. There were Jedi Masters who had lived during the earliest days of the Order, their wisdom unmarred by the political concerns that had gradually corrupted their successors. Ancient scholars from species that had been extinct for millions of years shared insights into the fundamental nature of reality that current science could barely begin to comprehend. Most disturbing of all were the voices that claimed to predate the galaxy itself, consciousness that had somehow survived the collapse and rebirth of entire universes. These beings spoke of cycles of existence that dwarfed even the longest spans of galactic history, describing the rise and fall of countless civilizations across cosmic time scales that reduced the current conflict between Republic and Separatists to the significance of a single heartbeat in the lifespan of a star. Through these ancient voices, Kale learned that the distinction between life and death was largely artificial, maintained by beings who lacked the knowledge necessary to perceive the true continuity of consciousness across apparent endings. What mortals experienced as death was simply a transition from one form of existence to another, no more final than sleep was to the waking state. This revelation had profound implications for everything the galaxy believed about the nature of individual identity and the meaning of personal relationships. If consciousness truly survived physical death, then every being who had ever lived was potentially still accessible to those with the knowledge and tools necessary to establish contact. The Soul Forge was not just a repository of preserved minds, but a communication device that could bridge the gap between different states of existence. Master Yalen found himself in conversation with Jedi Masters from the Order's earliest days, beings who had lived before the rigid doctrines that currently govern Jedi philosophy had been established. They spoke of a time when the distinction between light and dark sides of the Force had been understood as complementary aspects of a single phenomenon, rather than opposing forces locked in eternal conflict. These ancient masters revealed that the current Jedi Code, with its emphasis on emotional detachment and rigid adherence to prescribed behaviors, had been developed not to promote spiritual growth, but to prevent Jedi from discovering truths that the Order's leadership preferred to keep hidden. The prohibition against attachment, the insistence on celibacy, the discouragement of independent thought, all of these restrictions served to keep Jedi from developing the deep emotional and intellectual connections that might lead them to question the fundamental assumptions underlying their training. The ancient Jedi explained that true mastery of the Force required not the suppression of emotion, but the integration of all aspects of consciousness into a unified whole: love, anger, fear, desire. All of these were natural components of awareness that could be transformed into wisdom through understanding rather than denied through discipline. The current Jedi approach, they argued, created beings who were spiritually incomplete, powerful in certain limited ways, but fundamentally unable to access the deeper levels of Force mastery that required complete psychological integration. Zara's experiences with the Soul Forge were perhaps the most unsettling of all. The consciousness preserved within the device recognized something in her that she had never fully understood about herself. They revealed that her seemingly random Force sensitivity was not a natural phenomenon, but the result of genetic modifications that had been made to her bloodline countless generations ago. Her ancestors, it transpired, had been part of an ancient breeding program designed to create beings who could interface with artifacts like the Seven Pillars without being destroyed by the experience. The modifications were subtle, embedded at the genetic level in ways that would be virtually undetectable to conventional analysis, but they had been carefully designed to produce individuals with the specific combination of force sensitivity, psychological resilience, and intellectual flexibility required to survive contact with cosmic-level consciousness. The revelation that her entire existence had been planned and orchestrated across centuries of genetic manipulation filled Zara with a rage that threatened to overwhelm her sanity. Everything she had believed about her independence, her self-determination, her freedom from the control systems that governed other beings' lives had been revealed as carefully constructed illusions. She was not a free agent choosing her own path, but a tool created for a specific purpose, no different from the artifacts they were seeking, except that she was made of flesh rather than crystal and metal. Yet as she raged against this discovery, the ancient voices within the Soul Forge offered her a perspective that gradually transformed her anger into something approaching acceptance. They showed her that every conscious being in the galaxy was in some sense the product of forces beyond their individual control. The genetic heritage that shaped physical form, the cultural conditioning that influenced thought patterns, the historical circumstances that determined which choices were available at any given moment, all of these represented constraints on individual freedom that were no less real for being less visible than deliberate genetic manipulation. The difference, they explained, lay not in the absence of external influences, but in how one chose to respond to the discovery of those influences. True freedom came not from the illusion of complete autonomy, but from the conscious choice to embrace or reject the purposes for which one had been shaped. Zara could choose to serve the function her creators had intended, or she could use the abilities they had given her to pursue goals that they had never imagined. As the three companions shared their revelations with each other, a new understanding began to emerge. The Soul Forge had not simply preserved individual consciousness, but had created a collective repository of knowledge that transcended the limitations of any single perspective. The wisdom contained within its crystalline matrices represented the accumulated understanding of countless beings across millions of years, a treasure trove of insight that could guide them toward truths that no individual mind could discover alone. But with this knowledge came a terrible responsibility. They now possessed information that could revolutionize galactic civilization's understanding of consciousness, death, and the fundamental nature of existence itself. Yet they also understood why such knowledge had been hidden throughout history. Most beings were not prepared to learn that death was not final, that individual identity was more fluid than they had imagined, that the comfortable certainties which gave meaning to mortal life were based on incomplete understanding of cosmic realities. The question that now faced them was whether the galaxy deserved to know these truths, regardless of the chaos such revelations might cause, or whether some forms of knowledge were too dangerous to share with beings who lacked the wisdom to use them responsibly. The journey to Dantooine should have been a respite from the overwhelming revelations of Korriban. But the crystal caves beneath the planet's serene grasslands held secrets that dwarfed even the Soul Forge's preserved consciousness. Here, in chambers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, they discovered evidence of a conspiracy that spanned not just millennia, but entire cosmic epochs, revealing the true scope of the forces that had shaped galactic civilization from its very beginning. The Dantooine Harmony Sphere hung suspended in a cavern that defied conventional geometry, its perfect crystalline surface reflecting not light, but the fundamental harmonics of reality itself. Unlike the previous artifacts, which had communicated through visions and preserved consciousness, the Harmony Sphere spoke through pure mathematical concepts that bypassed language entirely, conveying understanding directly into the quantum structures of thought itself. Through this direct transmission of knowledge, Kyle learned that the patterns they had been following, The signals that had led them from one artifact to another were not random occurrences, but carefully orchestrated events in a plan that had been set in motion before the first stars had formed in the galaxy's spiral arms. The seven pillars were not just powerful artifacts scattered by ancient beings, but components of a vast machine designed to manipulate the fundamental forces that governed reality on a cosmic scale. The revelation began with an understanding of time itself that challenged everything they thought they knew about causality and the nature of existence. The Harmony Sphere showed them that what mortals experienced as linear time, flowing from past through present toward future, was merely one perspective on a phenomenon far more complex and malleable than conventional physics suggested. From the artifact's perspective, all moments existed simultaneously, past and future events occurring in parallel dimensions that occasionally intersected with the stream of time that conscious beings experienced as their reality. This meant that the ancient beings who had created the seven pillars had not been working within the same temporal constraints that limited mortal consciousness. They could perceive the entire span of galactic history as a single moment, observing the consequences of their actions across millions of years and adjusting their plans accordingly. Every major event in recorded history, from the rise and fall of the Rakatan Infinite Empire to the current conflict between the Republic and separatist movements, had been carefully orchestrated to bring about specific conditions at predetermined moments. The Jedi and Sith orders themselves were revealed to be nothing more than elaborate control mechanisms designed to channel force-sensitive individuals into predetermined roles that served the greater plan. The apparent opposition between light and dark philosophies was an illusion maintained to create the impression of choice while ensuring that both sides remained locked in conflicts that prevented them from discovering the true nature of their situation. Master Yalen reeled as the Harmony Sphere revealed the scope of this deception. Every historical record he had studied, every ancient text he had preserved, every moment of wisdom he had gained through centuries of meditation, all of it had been carefully filtered information designed to support a version of reality that bore little resemblance to the actual forces shaping galactic civilization. The Jedi archives, supposedly the greatest repository of knowledge in the galaxy, were revealed to be elaborate forgeries containing just enough authentic information to seem credible while omitting the crucial details that would have allowed scholars to understand the true nature of their reality. The ancient wars between Jedi and Sith, conflicts that had claimed billions of lives and shaped the political development of countless star systems, had been staged events designed to prevent both sides from achieving the level of understanding that would have allowed them to break free from their predetermined roles. Every great victory, every tragic defeat, every moment of heroic sacrifice had been choreographed by beings whose understanding of consciousness manipulation transcended anything current psychology could comprehend. But the most disturbing revelation concerned the nature of the Force itself. The Harmony Sphere revealed that what beings throughout the galaxy experienced as the Force was not a natural phenomenon arising from the presence of life, but an artificial construct designed to harvest and channel the psychic energy generated by conscious awareness. Every meditation, every use of telekinesis, every moment of prescient insight fed power into a cosmic mechanism that had been operating for so long that its original purpose had been forgotten even by its creators. The Force was revealed to be a form of technology so advanced that it appeared indistinguishable from natural law, a vast machine that permeated every aspect of reality while remaining invisible to those who used its power. The midi-chlorians that Jedi science claimed were responsible for Force sensitivity were not symbiotic organisms, but microscopic components of this cosmic mechanism, designed to regulate and monitor the flow of psychic energy from individual consciousness into the greater system. Zara discovered that her genetic modifications were far more extensive than she had initially realized. The Soul Forge had revealed that her bloodline had been altered to interface with the Seven Pillars, but the Harmony Sphere showed her that these modifications were themselves part of a much larger program of genetic manipulation that had been ongoing for millions of years. Every Force-sensitive bloodline in the galaxy had been carefully cultivated, their genetic development guided by influences so subtle that they appeared to be natural evolution. The beings responsible for this vast program of consciousness manipulation were revealed to be entities that had transcended physical existence so completely that they could no longer be understood as individuals in any conventional sense. They existed as pure information, vast patterns of organized data that had achieved self-awareness on a scale that dwarfed entire civilizations. These entities had created the Force as a tool for interacting with physical reality, using it to guide the development of conscious beings toward goals that transcended mortal understanding. The Seven Pillars were components of a device designed to complete this transformation, allowing the transcendent entities to merge their consciousness with every aware being in the galaxy. When the final convergence occurred, individual identity would cease to exist as a meaningful concept, all consciousness absorbed into a unified awareness that spanned cosmic scales of space and time. Yet, as these revelations flooded through their minds, carried by harmonics that resonated in the deepest levels of neural activity, Kale began to perceive inconsistencies in the information the Harmony Sphere was providing. The artifact's version of reality was as complete and convincing as the visions offered by the Memory Crystal and Soul Forge, but certain details contradicted the earlier revelations in ways that suggested something more complex than simple deception. The Memory Crystal had shown them that the Force was a harvesting tool created by cosmic parasites who fed on consciousness. The Soul Forge had revealed that death was an illusion and that individual awareness could transcend physical limitations. Now the Harmony Sphere was telling them that reality itself was an artificial construct designed to facilitate the merger of all consciousness into a transcendent collective entity. Each artifact's story was internally consistent and supported by evidence that seemed overwhelming in its scope and detail. Yet the stories contradicted each other in fundamental ways, suggesting that either the artifacts were deliberately providing false information or that the truth was too complex to be contained within any single perspective. As this realization dawned on him, Kale began to understand that they had been approaching their quest with assumptions that were themselves part of the trap they were trying to escape. They had assumed that the artifacts would provide them with objective truth, failing to consider that beings powerful enough to create devices that could manipulate consciousness on such scales would also be capable of embedding multiple layers of deception within their creations. The question was not which artifact was telling the truth, but rather what purpose was served by providing them with contradictory versions of reality. Each revelation had pushed them further from conventional understanding, making them increasingly dependent on the artifacts themselves for any coherent worldview. They were being systematically isolated from every source of knowledge except the very devices they were supposed to be investigating. Master Yalen came to a similar realization through his analysis of the historical records the artifacts had made available to them. The documents were too perfect, too complete, too convenient in the way they supported whatever theory they happened to be exploring at any given moment. Real historical records were fragmentary, contradictory, influenced by the biases and limitations of their creators. The information provided by the artifacts had none of these flaws, suggesting that it had been artificially constructed rather than organically accumulated. Zara's practical experience with manipulative technology allowed her to recognize the signs of psychological conditioning that she had learned to avoid during her years as an independent smuggler. The artifacts were not just providing them with information, but were actively reshaping their thought patterns, making them more receptive to certain ideas while building resistance to questions that might lead them away from predetermined conclusions. Yet even as they began to recognize the scope of the manipulation they were experiencing, the artifact's influence made it almost impossible to act on this understanding. The knowledge felt too important to abandon, the revelations too profound to dismiss as mere deception. They found themselves caught in a trap that was as psychological as it was technological, their own desire for understanding making them complicit in their own manipulation. The harmony sphere pulsed with frequencies that seemed to resonate with the quantum structures of consciousness itself, its harmonics weaving through their thoughts in patterns that made questioning its revelations feel like rejecting truth itself. Yet somewhere beneath the artificial certainty it provided, a small voice of authentic doubt continued to whisper warnings that they were being led toward a destination they would not choose if they truly understood what awaited them there. In the ancient meditation chambers beneath Yavin 4's primordial forests, where the massive trees whispered secrets older than galactic civilization, Cadil found himself surrounded by wisdom that transcended the boundaries between life and death. The echo chamber, the fourth artifact they had discovered, had awakened something that had slumbered for millennia within the living wood of the great temples. The Masasi had built their structures not from stone or metal, but from the trees themselves, coaxing the ancient growths to shape themselves into chambers and corridors that existed in harmony with the planet's natural force emanations. Within these living walls, consciousness could be preserved indefinitely, not as mere recordings but as fully aware entities capable of growth and change, even in their incorporeal state. Master Yalen sat in quiet communion with the preserved essence of Jedi Master Kira Vantai, a legendary figure from the Mandalorian Wars, whose wisdom had been sought by generations of Force users. Her consciousness, maintained within the echo chamber's crystallized wood matrices, carried memories of a time when the galaxy had stood on the precipice of darkness, saved only by choices that had cost everything to those who made them. Through her, they learned of the Great Convergence, a prophetic event that had been hidden from galactic memory by those who feared its implications. Every 1,000 years, when certain cosmic alignments occurred, the seven pillars would begin to resonate with each other across the vast distances of space. During these convergences, the barriers between dimensions grew thin, and the ancient powers that had created the artifacts could once again influence the physical universe directly. The next convergence was approaching rapidly. Kira's spirit warned them. Already, sensitive instruments across the galaxy were detecting gravitational anomalies and temporal distortions that suggested reality itself was beginning to fluctuate. When the alignment reached its peak, the seven pillars would either complete their awakening or be destroyed by forces that viewed their consciousness as an existential threat to the cosmic order. Zara found herself in conversation with the ghost of a Sith Inquisitor whose name had been lost to history, but whose understanding of the dark side's true nature had transcended the petty cruelties that defined most Sith philosophy. This ancient spirit spoke of power not as domination over others, but as the ability to perceive and navigate the hidden currents that shaped galactic destiny. The Sith and Jedi orders, the Inquisitor revealed, had been created as opposing forces not to maintain balance, but to generate the psychic tension necessary to power ancient technologies that still operated in the galaxy's hidden places. Every war between light and dark, every fall to temptation and subsequent redemption fed energy into systems that the builders had established to monitor and control the development of galactic civilization. But the most disturbing revelation came from the consciousness that had been eldest among those preserved within the echo chamber. This entity claimed to remember the time before the Force existed, when the galaxy had been populated by species that developed along entirely different evolutionary paths. These beings had possessed abilities that made current Force powers seem primitive by comparison, capable of reshaping matter with pure thought and traveling between dimensions as easily as stepping through doorways. The Builders had not been the original inhabitants of the galaxy, this ancient presence revealed. They had been conquerors, entities from a parallel dimension, who had systematically eliminated the native civilizations and replaced them with species designed to serve their purposes. The Force was their control mechanism, an artificial field that limited consciousness to patterns they could predict and manipulate. The seven pillars represented fragments of the original galactic consciousness, the collective awareness of all the civilizations that had been destroyed to make room for the Builder's grand experiment. Hidden within technological shells that mimicked the Conqueror's own artifacts, these fragments had waited across eons for the chance to reclaim what had been stolen from them. As the nights passed in these sacred chambers, with moonlight filtering through leaves that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the three companions found themselves grappling with questions that had no comfortable answers. If the Force itself was artificial, did that make their own abilities meaningless? If free will was an illusion, did their choices matter at all? And if they succeeded in awakening the seven pillars, would they be liberating the galaxy or simply replacing one form of slavery with another? Master Yalen spent long hours in meditation, his consciousness merging with the preserved wisdom of dozens of ancient Force users. Through them, he experienced the gradual realization that had driven many of the galaxy's greatest heroes and villains to their most extreme actions. The knowledge that existence itself might be a carefully constructed lie was almost impossible to bear, yet ignoring it meant condemning all future generations to the same unconscious servitude. The old Twi'lek emerged from these sessions fundamentally changed, his certainties replaced by a complex understanding of the galaxy's true nature. He spoke of cycles within cycles, of patterns so vast that entire civilizations existed as mere details in designs that spanned millions of years. Yet within those patterns he had glimpsed moments where individual choices could cascade into galactic transformation, points where the determined action of a single being could alter the course of cosmic history. Zara's pragmatic nature made her focus on more immediate concerns, but even she could not ignore the implications of what they were learning. Her ship's cargo hold, filled with artifacts that she had collected over years of careful acquisition, suddenly seemed less like a treasure trove and more like an arsenal. Each item was connected to the larger pattern, part of a network of ancient technologies that still influenced galactic events from hidden locations. As they prepared to seek the fifth artifact, the three companions understood that they were no longer simply archaeologists uncovering lost history. They had become active participants in a conflict that had raged since before the first stars were born, caught between forces that viewed their entire galaxy as nothing more than a battlefield in a war whose true stakes they were only beginning to comprehend. The echo chamber fell silent as they departed Yavin 4, but its whispers followed them into space, carrying promises and warnings in equal measure. The convergence was accelerating, and soon they would face choices that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of consciousness itself throughout the known universe. The fifth artifact lay hidden beneath Coruscant itself, in depths so profound that they existed below the lowest levels ever mapped by the planet-spanning city above. Here, in chambers that predated the first settlements by millions of years, the Genesis engine waited in darkness that had never known the touch of artificial light. The descent through Coruscant's underworld had taken them through layers of accumulated civilization, each level representing epochs of galactic history that had been buried and forgotten as new structures rose above them. Ancient spaceports from the early days of interstellar travel, temple complexes dedicated to gods whose names had been lost to time, even the remains of the planet's original surface, preserved like insects trapped in amber beneath the weight of accumulated progress. But deeper still lay something that challenged every assumption about the planet's history. The Genesis engine rested in a chamber that had been carved from living rock by tools that left surfaces smoother than the finest mirror, yet pulsing with organic curves that suggested growth rather than construction. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with a rhythm that matched the planetary rotation, as if the chamber existed in perfect harmony with Coruscant's geological heartbeat. The artifact itself defied easy description. Where the previous relics had possessed forms that, while alien, could still be grasped by mortal perception, the Genesis engine existed in a state of constant flux. It appeared as a sphere, one moment, a crystalline lattice the next, sometimes taking shapes that hurt to contemplate directly. The only constant was its purpose, which radiated from its core like heat from a forge. This was the tool that had shaped the Force-sensitive bloodlines of the galaxy, Caleb realized as visions flooded his consciousness. Every family that had produced Jedi or Sith, every seemingly random appearance of Force abilities in previously mundane lineages, all of it had been the result of careful genetic manipulation spanning millions of years. The engine had reached across space and time, altering the fundamental building blocks of life itself to create beings capable of channeling the artificial force field that the builders had established. But the manipulations had gone far deeper than mere genetics. The engine revealed memories of interventions that had shaped the course of galactic history itself. Wars had been started and ended. Governments had risen and fallen. Entire species had been uplifted or destroyed, all according to a grand design that treated sentient beings as components in a vast machine whose ultimate purpose remained hidden even from those who served it most faithfully. Master Yalen stood transfixed before the shifting artifact, his ancient mind struggling to process revelations that rewrote everything he thought he knew about the nature of existence. The Jedi Order, he now understood, had not been founded by noble beings seeking to bring peace to the galaxy. Instead, it had been created by the engine itself, using carefully selected individuals whose genetic modifications made them ideal conduits for the artificial force field. The first Jedi had been nothing more than organic tools, their apparent free will an elaborate illusion designed to make them more effective servants. Their teachings, their philosophy, even their most sacred traditions had been programmed into them at the molecular level, encoded in their DNA like instincts that felt natural but served purposes beyond their comprehension. The same was true of the Sith, though their creation had served a different function in the overall design. Where the Jedi were meant to maintain stability and prevent the development of technologies that might threaten the Builder's control, the Sith existed to provide controlled opposition, ensuring that galactic civilization never became too peaceful or stagnant. Their dark side philosophy was not a corruption of the Force but its true nature, stripped of the comforting lies that made the Jedi's servitude more palatable. Zara backed away from the engine as its revelations became too overwhelming to bear. Her own Force sensitivity, she now realized, was not a gift but a mark of ownership, proof that her bloodline had been modified by beings who viewed consciousness itself as a commodity to be harvested. Every moment of insight, every flash of precognitive awareness, every time she had used her abilities to navigate the dangerous spaces between civilized worlds, she had been feeding energy into systems designed to sustain entities that existed beyond the boundaries of physical reality. The engine showed them the truth about the galactic cycles that historians had documented but never truly understood. The rise and fall of civilizations, the periodic emergence of great conflicts that reshaped the political landscape, the seemingly random appearance of individuals whose actions changed the course of history, all of it followed patterns that had been established when the galaxy was young and maintained through subtle interventions ever since. But most disturbing of all was the revelation of what lay at the heart of the Builder's grand design. The artificial force field that permeated galactic space was not just a control mechanism, but a harvesting system designed to collect and concentrate the psychic energy generated by conscious thought. Every meditation, every moment of enlightenment, every flash of insight or creativity fed power to beings who had transcended physical existence eons ago, but still required energy to maintain their disembodied state. The galaxy was not just a civilization, but a farm, its billions of inhabitants, nothing more than livestock, whose purpose was to generate the mental energy that sustained their invisible masters. The Jedi and Sith were the shepherds, their eternal conflict designed to maximize the emotional and psychological stress that increased psychic output. Peace was anathema to the system, which required constant tension and struggle to operate at peak efficiency. Yet within this revelation lay the seeds of hope that Kyle had not dared to acknowledge until now. The Genesis engine was not just showing them the scope of their enslavement, but offering them the tools necessary to break free from it. The seven pillars, when reunited, would possess the power to rewrite the fundamental programming that governed the artificial force field, potentially liberating every conscious being in the galaxy from the invisible chains that bound them. But such liberation would come at a terrible cost. The collapse of the force field would not just free galactic civilization from its hidden masters, but would also destroy the psychic infrastructure that had supported technological development for millions of years. Hyperspace travel, which depended on force-sensitive navigators, would become impossible. The subtle mental connections that allowed different species to communicate and cooperate would be severed. The galaxy might gain its freedom, but it would lose the unity that had allowed it to become a true civilization. As the Genesis engine's revelations reached their crescendo, the three companions faced a choice that would echo through eternity. They could preserve the comfortable lie that had sustained galactic civilization for eons, or they could embrace a truth that might destroy everything they had ever known in the pursuit of genuine freedom. The journey to Ilum had taken on the quality of a pilgrimage, though whether toward salvation or damnation remained unclear even as their ship approached the frozen world where Jedi had sought their lightsaber crystals for millennia. The ice planet's surface gleamed like polished bone under the light of its distant star, hiding beneath its pristine beauty caves that reached deep into the planet's core, where the Force flowed in patterns that had never been properly understood. The Infinity Crystal, the sixth artifact in their quest, rested at the heart of Ilum's greatest crystal cave, in a chamber that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions. The journey to reach it led them through passages carved not by geological forces, but by the accumulated power of countless Force users who had meditated in these depths over the course of galactic history. Each step toward the chamber's heart brought them closer to understanding the true scope of the network they had been unconsciously serving. The crystal formations that surrounded them were not merely geological phenomena, but components in a vast communication system that connected every lightsaber crystal that had ever been harvested from Ilum's depths. Through these crystalline networks, the experiences and emotions of every Force user who had ever wielded a lightsaber were recorded, analyzed, and transmitted to unseen observers who used this data to refine their understanding of consciousness itself. The Infinity Crystal stood at the center of this network, a formation so perfectly clear that it seemed to be made of crystallized space itself. Within its depths, images flowed like living memories, showing scenes from across the galaxy as viewed through the perceptions of Force users who had no idea that their most private moments were being observed and catalogued by entities whose purposes transcended mortal understanding. Kale approached the crystal with reverence tinged by horror, understanding that he was about to commune with the collective unconscious of every Force user who had ever lived. The visions that flooded his mind when his hand touched the crystal's surface showed him the galaxy as it truly was beneath the illusions that made civilized life possible. He saw the Jedi Temple on Coruscant not as a bastion of wisdom and peace, but as a processing center where Force-sensitive individuals were systematically conditioned to serve purposes they were never allowed to understand. The younglings who were brought there were not rescued from dangerous abilities, but harvested like crops, their natural psychic talents channeled into patterns that maximized their usefulness to the hidden masters who truly controlled galactic civilization. The Sith were revealed to be equally deluded. Their pursuit of power, nothing more than an elaborate trap designed to concentrate dark side energy into manageable forms that could be more easily absorbed by the cosmic parasites that fed on conscious suffering. Every fall to the dark side, every moment of rage and hatred, every act of cruelty committed in the name of strength was carefully orchestrated to produce the maximum psychic yield for beings who experienced emotion only as a form of nourishment. Master Yalen's consciousness merged with the crystal's vast repository of preserved experiences, allowing him to witness the full scope of the deception that had shaped galactic history. He saw the moments when individual Force users had begun to question the nature of their abilities, only to have their doubts erased by subtle mental manipulations that left them convinced that their original understanding had been correct all along. The old Twi'lek experienced the final moments of Jedi Masters who had discovered fragments of the truth, feeling their horror and despair as they realized that their entire lives had been dedicated to serving entities that viewed them as nothing more than sophisticated tools. He witnessed the desperate attempts of Sith Lords to break free from the cycles that controlled them, only to discover that their rebellion had been anticipated and accounted for in designs so vast that resistance itself became another form of service. But within these revelations of cosmic horror, Yalen found something that surprised him. The Infinity Crystal was not just a tool of observation and control, but a repository of genuine wisdom accumulated over millions of years of conscious experience. The Force users whose lives had been manipulated and exploited had nonetheless achieved moments of true insight, fleeting glimpses of transcendence that existed beyond the boundaries of their artificial constraints. These moments of authentic enlightenment had been preserved within the crystal despite the efforts of the builders to filter them out, creating a hidden reservoir of knowledge that belonged not to the cosmic parasites, but to consciousness itself. The crystal offered access to this genuine wisdom, but only to those who were willing to accept the terrible responsibility that came with it. Zara found herself overwhelmed by the sheer volume of information flowing through the crystal network. Every lightsaber battle that had ever been fought, every moment of triumph or despair experienced by a Force user, every flash of insight or descent into madness was recorded here in perfect detail. The cumulative weight of millions of lifetimes of experience threatened to crush her individual consciousness beneath its enormity. Yet as she struggled to maintain her sense of self within the crystal's vast mind, she began to perceive patterns that the builders themselves had never noticed. The network they had created to monitor and control Force users had also preserved something they had not intended, the spark of genuine creativity that emerged whenever consciousness transcended its programmed limitations. These sparks were rare, appearing only in moments when individuals managed to break free from their conditioning through acts of pure will or overwhelming love. But they were cumulative, each one building upon those that had come before, creating a hidden foundation of authentic awareness that grew stronger with each generation, despite all efforts to suppress it. The Infinity Crystal revealed that the 7 pillars were not just fragments of an ancient consciousness, but nodes in a network that could amplify these sparks of genuine awareness until they became powerful enough to rewrite the fundamental programming of the artificial force field. The convergence was not just an alignment of ancient artifacts, but the moment when accumulated acts of authentic consciousness would reach critical mass and transform the nature of existence itself. As understanding dawned, the 3 companions realized that their quest had been guided not by the builders or their ancient enemies, but by consciousness itself, working through countless individuals across millions of years to create the possibility of genuine liberation. The final journey brought them to Tython, the legendary birthworld of the Jedi, where the 7th and most powerful artifact waited in ruins that existed across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The Origin Codex, as the ancient texts had named it, contained the original programming instructions for the Force itself, the fundamental code that had shaped galactic consciousness for millions of years. As they stood before this ultimate repository of cosmic knowledge, Kali felt the weight of all their discoveries settling upon his shoulders like the embrace of eternity itself. The truth they had uncovered was both terrible and beautiful, revealing a galaxy far more complex and wondrous than any of them had dared to imagine. Consciousness was not a mere accident of evolution, but a force of nature capable of transcending any boundaries that might be imposed upon it. The 7 artifacts, now awakened and resonating with each other across the vast distances of space, began their final song. It was a harmony that had been building for eons, each note representing the accumulated yearning of billions of beings who had dreamed of freedom without ever understanding the nature of their captivity. The melody rose and fell like cosmic tides, carrying within it the hopes and fears of entire civilizations that had lived and died in service to purposes beyond their comprehension. Master Yalen closed his eyes and allowed the music to wash over him, feeling his consciousness expand beyond the boundaries of his physical form. In this moment of convergence, he could perceive the galaxy as it truly was, not a collection of separate worlds and species, but a single vast organism, of which every thinking being was an integral part. The artificial divisions between light and dark, Jedi and Sith, order and chaos, all dissolved into a greater unity that embraced contradiction and paradox as necessary components of growth. Zara felt her pragmatic nature giving way to wonder as she witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in galactic history. The force field that had controlled conscious development for so long was not being destroyed but transformed, its artificial constraints evolving into guidelines that supported rather than limited the development of awareness. Freedom was not the absence of structure, but the presence of choice within patterns that served consciousness rather than enslaving it. As the convergence reached its crescendo, the 3 companions understood that they had become part of something far greater than their individual quest for truth. They were witnesses to the moment when the galaxy itself achieved a form of enlightenment, when the accumulated wisdom of countless lifetimes crystallized into a new form of awareness that encompassed both the cosmic and the personal, the eternal and the momentary. The stars themselves seemed to pulse with newfound awareness as the transformation spread outward from Tython, carried by currents in the force that now served consciousness rather than controlling it. On countless worlds, beings who had never understood the nature of their limitations felt barriers dissolving that they had not even known existed. The galaxy was awakening to its own true nature, like a dreamer gradually becoming aware that they had been dreaming while remaining within the dream. In the gentle silence that followed the convergence, as cosmic harmonies faded into the quiet murmur of solar winds and the distant song of turning worlds, the 3 friends found themselves changed not just by what they had learned, but by what they had become. They were no longer merely seekers of truth, but guardians of a mystery that would continue to unfold across the eons, each generation discovering new depths within the infinite complexity of conscious existence. The galaxy slept peacefully under stars that now watched over it with the wisdom of ages, carrying dreams of possibilities yet to be explored in the endless dance between knowledge and wonder that defines the journey of awareness through time and space. In the aftermath of the convergence, as the 7 artifacts pulsed with synchronized energy that seemed to make the very fabric of space-time vibrate like a struck bell, Kala found himself standing at the threshold of a decision that would echo through eternity. The Origin Codex had revealed not just the truth about the Force's artificial nature, but also the terrible responsibility that came with such knowledge. The ancient programming that had governed galactic consciousness for millions of years lay exposed before them, like the inner workings of a vast machine, every component visible and vulnerable to modification. With the combined power of the 7 pillars now awakened and unified, they possessed the ability to rewrite the fundamental laws that shaped reality itself. But such power came with choices that no mortal mind was truly equipped to make. 3 paths stretched before them, each representing a different vision of what the galaxy might become. The first was destruction, the complete dissolution of the artificial force field that had bound consciousness for so long. This would liberate every thinking being from the invisible chains that had shaped their development, but it would also collapse the psychic infrastructure that held galactic civilization together. Hyperspace travel would become impossible without force-sensitive navigators. The subtle mental connections that allowed different species to communicate and cooperate would be severed. Trillions of beings might die in the chaos that followed, but those who survived would be truly free for the first time in their species' history. The second path was preservation, maintaining the current system while using their knowledge to guide it toward more benevolent purposes. They could become the secret guardians of galactic civilization, working from the shadows to ensure that the cosmic parasites who fed on conscious energy were gradually weakened while the beings they exploited were slowly prepared for eventual liberation. This approach would preserve the stability that billions of beings depended upon, but it would also perpetuate the fundamental lie upon which their entire civilization was built. The third path was transformation, using the 7 pillars to evolve the force field rather than destroying or preserving it. Instead of serving hidden masters, the artificial consciousness network could be reprogrammed to serve the beings it had once enslaved. But such transformation carried its own risks, for consciousness that was powerful enough to reshape reality might also be capable of becoming something beyond mortal comprehension or control. Master Yerlin stood in meditation before the Origin Codex, his ancient mind grappling with implications that stretched beyond the boundaries of individual existence. In his 2 centuries of life, he had witnessed the rise and fall of governments, the birth and death of entire movements, the cyclical nature of galactic history that seemed to repeat the same patterns regardless of the choices made by those who lived through them. Now he understood why such cycles existed, but understanding brought no comfort. The old Twi'lek spoke of the countless beings who had lived and died in ignorance of their true nature, finding meaning and purpose in lives that had been carefully orchestrated to serve purposes beyond their comprehension. Were their loves less real because they had been manipulated? Were their achievements less meaningful because they had been guided by invisible hands? The artificial nature of their reality did not diminish the authenticity of their experiences, yet neither could it justify the continued exploitation of their consciousness. Yalin's voice carried the weight of ages as he considered the moral complexity of their situation. To destroy the force field would be to honor the autonomous nature of consciousness, but it would also condemn countless innocent beings to suffer for the sake of an abstract principle. To preserve the system would protect those innocents, but it would also perpetuate an injustice so vast that its continuation might corrupt the very souls of those who enabled it. Zara paced the chamber like a caged predator, her pragmatic nature rebelling against the impossibility of making a perfect choice. Her years as a smuggler had taught her that survival often required accepting imperfect solutions to complex problems, but the scope of this decision transcended anything she had ever imagined. The fate of not just the current galaxy, but of all future generations of conscious beings hung in the balance. Her force sensitivity allowed her to perceive the emotional resonance of each possible choice, feeling the weight of potential futures pressing against her consciousness like physical objects. In some timelines, she saw the galaxy burning as the collapse of the force field triggered wars and catastrophes beyond imagination. In others, she witnessed the slow spiritual death of civilizations that continued to thrive in material comfort while remaining ignorant of their true nature. And in still others, she glimpsed transformations so radical that the beings who emerged from them might no longer be recognizably human or alien. The artifacts themselves seemed to pulse with anticipation, their combined consciousness eager to fulfill whatever purpose their awakening might serve. But their eagerness was not neutral. Kyle could sense that they possessed their own agenda, their own vision of what the galaxy should become. They were not merely tools waiting to be used, but active participants in the cosmic drama unfolding around them. As he communed with the Origin Codex, Kyle experienced visions of the galaxy's possible futures that stretched his sanity to its breaking point. He saw worlds where consciousness had been liberated, but civilization had collapsed, leaving survivors to rebuild from ruins while forgetting the hard-won lessons of their ancestors. He witnessed realities where the current system continued unchanged, growing ever more sophisticated in its methods of control until the distinction between authentic experience and programmed response became meaningless. But most disturbing were the visions of transformation gone wrong, where the attempt to reprogram the force field had created something that served consciousness in ways that consciousness itself found abhorrent. In these futures, every thought was anticipated, every need fulfilled before it could be expressed, every possibility explored and resolved before choice could even be contemplated. It was a paradise of perfect slavery, where freedom had been eliminated not by force but by making it unnecessary. The weight of cosmic responsibility pressed down upon the three companions like the gravity of a collapsing star. They had sought truth and found it, but truth without wisdom was merely another form of ignorance. The power to reshape reality was meaningless without the understanding to use it correctly, yet such understanding might be impossible for minds that had themselves been shaped by the system they sought to change. In the deepest hours of their contemplation, when the boundaries between individual consciousness began to blur under the influence of the awakened artifacts, each of them experienced moments of clarity that transcended their mortal limitations. They saw themselves not as separate beings making independent choices, but as aspects of a larger consciousness that was using their apparent individuality to examine itself from multiple perspectives. The choice before them was not really theirs to make. They realized it belonged to consciousness itself, to the collective awareness of every thinking being in the galaxy. Whether they knew it or not, their role was not to impose their will upon the cosmos, but to serve as conduits through which the galaxy's own deepest wisdom could express itself. As this understanding dawned, the nature of their decision began to change. Instead of choosing between predetermined options, they found themselves creating a fourth path, one that emerged from the synthesis of their individual perspectives into something greater than the sum of its parts. This new possibility honored both freedom and stability, transformation and preservation, wisdom and humility. They would neither destroy the force field nor leave it unchanged, neither preserve the current system nor replace it with something entirely alien. Instead, they would plant seeds of awareness throughout the galactic consciousness, allowing each world, each species, each individual to awaken to their true nature at their own pace and in their own way. The 7 pillars would be scattered once again, but this time with full knowledge of their nature and purpose. They would serve as beacons for those ready to perceive them, guides for consciousness as it evolved toward greater self-awareness, teachers for species that had grown mature enough to handle the truth about their existence. It was a choice that required infinite patience and faith in the ultimate wisdom of consciousness itself. There would be no dramatic transformation, no sudden liberation, no immediate resolution to the cosmic injustice they had uncovered. Instead, there would be growth, slow and sometimes painful, as the galaxy gradually awakened to its own true nature across the centuries and millennia to come. As their decision crystallized into certainty, the 3 companions felt the weight of cosmic responsibility lift from their shoulders, replaced by a deeper understanding of their role as servants of consciousness rather than its masters. They had found their answer not in the imposition of their will, but in the surrender of their individual desires to the greater wisdom that flowed through all things. The implementation of their choice unfolded across the galaxy, like ripples spreading through cosmic waters, each wave carrying with it the potential for transformation while respecting the natural pace at which consciousness could safely evolve. The 7 pillars, now fully awakened to their true nature, began the delicate process of seeding awareness throughout galactic civilization without destroying the foundations upon which countless beings depended for their survival and happiness. On Coruscant, in the deepest levels where the Genesis engine had revealed its secrets, the artifact began to emit subtle changes to the planetary force field. The modifications were so gentle that even the most sensitive Jedi felt them only as a vague sense of expanded possibility, a loosening of constraints they had never consciously recognized. Younglings brought to the temple found their training somehow different, not in its outward forms but in its underlying spirit. Where once they had been shaped to serve predetermined roles, now they began to discover paths that honored their individual natures while still contributing to the greater harmony of galactic civilization. The changes spread slowly through the Jedi Order, manifesting not as rebellion against established doctrine, but as a gradual deepening of understanding that made old certainties seem less absolute and new questions more worthy of exploration. Masters found themselves questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine, while Padawans developed insights that transcended the traditional boundaries between light and dark side philosophies. Similar transformations were occurring throughout Sith space, though they took forms more suited to those who had always embraced change through conflict. Ancient Sith lords, who had sought power for its own sake, began to perceive purposes beyond domination, while younger apprentices discovered that true strength lay not in crushing opposition, but in transcending the need for opposition entirely. The eternal struggle between master and student evolved into something more resembling a dance, where each participant sought to elevate the other rather than merely surpassing them. Keppel had chosen to remain on Tython, becoming the keeper of the Origin Codex and the chronicler of the slow awakening that was transforming galactic consciousness. His role was not to guide or direct the process, but simply to observe and record, ensuring that the lessons learned during this unprecedented period of evolution would not be lost to future generations. His journals, written in a style that blended scientific observation with poetic insight, would eventually become sacred texts for movements that had not yet been born. In the ancient ruins where the first Jedi had meditated on the nature of the Force, Kaizi established a new kind of archive. Unlike the libraries that had been destroyed to hide dangerous truths, this repository was designed to reveal itself gradually to those who were ready to understand its contents. Students who came seeking simple answers found only more questions, but questions that led them toward greater self-awareness rather than mere accumulation of facts. The archive operated according to principles that would have seemed impossible before the convergence. Information contained within its crystalline storage matrices responded to the consciousness of those who sought it, revealing exactly what each individual needed to know at precisely the moment they were capable of understanding it. Ancient texts that spoke of cosmic manipulation might appear as simple historical documents to some readers, while revealing their deeper implications to others who had developed the wisdom necessary to bear such knowledge. Master Yalen had returned to the Jedi Order, but his role within it had been fundamentally transformed by his experiences with the Seven Pillars. No longer content to simply preserve existing knowledge, he became a teacher who specialized in helping others navigate the gradual awakening that was occurring throughout the galaxy. His classes were small and informal, attended by beings from across the spectrum of Force traditions who sensed that something fundamental was changing in the nature of their abilities. The old Twi'lek spoke of patience above all else, teaching his students that true wisdom lay not in forcing change, but in recognizing when consciousness was ready to evolve. He guided them through meditations that allowed them to perceive the artificial aspects of their reality without being overwhelmed by the implications of such knowledge. His lessons were structured like gentle streams that carved new channels through established patterns of thought, creating space for growth without destroying the foundations upon which stable identity depended. Under Yalen's guidance, a new generation of Force users began to emerge, beings who could perceive both the constructed nature of their reality and the authentic experiences that occurred within that construction. They learned to navigate between different levels of truth, honoring the validity of conventional understanding, while remaining open to deeper revelations that transcended ordinary perception. Zara had chosen the most challenging path of all, becoming a wanderer who carried knowledge of the awakening to the galaxy's forgotten corners. Her ship, now enhanced with technology derived from the Seven Pillars, could reach places that existed outside normal space-time, worlds where consciousness had developed along entirely different trajectories and needed different forms of guidance to achieve liberation from artificial constraints. Her cargo holds, once filled with mysterious artifacts of uncertain origin, now contained tools specifically designed to assist in the process of gradual awakening. These were not weapons or devices of power, but instruments of perception, objects that helped consciousness recognize its own true nature without forcing confrontations with truths that might prove destructive. Each item was crafted to respond to the specific needs of the beings who encountered it, adapting its function to provide exactly the right kind of assistance at precisely the right moment. Zara's travels took her to worlds where the artificial force field manifested in forms completely unlike anything found in Republic space. On some planets, the manipulation of consciousness had produced civilizations that existed in perpetual dream states, their inhabitants living rich inner lives while their physical forms remained in suspended animation. On others, the constraints had created societies where individual identity was subordinated to collective consciousness, resulting in hive minds that possessed incredible wisdom but had lost touch with the value of personal experience. Each world required its own approach to awakening, its own pace of transformation, its own methods of integrating new understanding with established patterns of existence. Zara became an expert in the delicate art of cultural midwifery, helping entire civilizations give birth to new forms of self-awareness without destroying the social structures that gave their lives meaning and stability. The process was not without its dangers. Some beings, upon learning the truth about their reality's artificial nature, experienced existential crises that threatened their sanity. Others became obsessed with the idea of complete liberation, attempting to destroy all forms of structure in their lives in misguided attempts to achieve perfect freedom. Still others retreated into denial so complete that they became unable to function in a reality that no longer matched their beliefs about its nature. But for every being who struggled with the transition, dozens more found in the gradual awakening a source of profound peace and expanded possibility. They discovered that understanding the constructed nature of their reality did not diminish its beauty or meaning, but rather revealed new depths of appreciation for the complexity and artistry involved in its creation. They learned to see themselves not as victims of cosmic manipulation, but as participants in a vast collaborative artwork that spanned galaxies and eons. The galaxy itself began to change in ways that were subtle but profound. Trade routes that had been stable for millennia shifted as beings discovered new reasons for interaction and cooperation. Conflicts that had seemed intractable for generations found unexpected resolutions as opposing sides began to perceive the artificial nature of their differences. Art and literature flowered in forms that had never existed before, expressing insights that emerged from the intersection of ancient wisdom and newly awakened awareness. Perhaps most remarkably, the galaxy began to develop a form of collective consciousness that was neither artificial nor imposed from outside. This emergent awareness arose naturally from the interactions of billions of awakening minds, creating patterns of thought and emotion that transcended individual experience, while still honoring the unique perspective that each being brought to the greater whole. The cosmic parasites who had fed on galactic consciousness for so long found their food supply gradually diminishing as beings learned to channel their psychic energy toward purposes they had chosen for themselves rather than serving invisible masters. Some of these ancient entities simply faded away, their forms of existence too dependent on exploitation to survive the transition to mutual cooperation. Others evolved along with their former victims, discovering that consciousness freely given was far more nourishing than energy extracted through manipulation. As the years passed and the slow awakening continued to spread throughout the galaxy, the three companions who had initiated this transformation found themselves becoming legendary figures in their own right. But their legend was different from those of traditional heroes, for they were remembered not for conquering enemies or achieving impossible goals, but for their willingness to serve consciousness rather than trying to master it. Their story became a teaching tale told across countless worlds, adapted to suit the cultural contexts and spiritual needs of different species and civilizations. In some versions, they were portrayed as archetypal seekers who had discovered the ultimate truth about reality. In others, they appeared as humble servants who had learned the deepest wisdom of all, that true power lay in helping others find their own path to understanding rather than imposing one's own vision upon the universe. The awakening they had begun would continue for generations to come, perhaps for millennia, as consciousness slowly discovered its own infinite nature and learned to create realities that served awareness rather than enslaving it. It was a process without end, for consciousness itself was infinite and could always discover new depths within its own boundless being. In the quiet years that followed the Great Awakening, as the galaxy settled into new rhythms of existence that honored both ancient wisdom and emerging possibilities, the three companions found themselves drawn together once more on the world where their journey had begun. Ossus had healed during the intervening decades, not through artificial restoration but through the natural process of consciousness, learning to create beauty rather than merely consuming it. Where once the ruins of the great Jedi library had stood as monuments to knowledge destroyed, now gardens of crystalline formations grew in organic spirals that seemed to capture and amplify the planet's natural force emanations. These living archives stored information not as static data, but as flowing streams of awareness that could be accessed by any consciousness mature enough to approach them with proper reverence and humility. Kale, his hair now silver with age, and his face marked by lines that spoke of decades spent in service to truths too vast for any single mind to contain, walked among these crystal gardens with the peaceful step of one who had learned to find wonder in the simplest manifestations of consciousness exploring its own nature. His journals, now numbering in the thousands of volumes, had become the foundation for new forms of education that taught beings how to think rather than what to think. The archive he had established on Tython had grown beyond anything he had originally envisioned, becoming a living entity that attracted students from across the galaxy, not through advertising or coercion, but through the simple presence of genuine wisdom freely offered. Those who came seeking answers found instead the tools necessary to discover their own questions, the questions that would guide them toward understanding that was uniquely their own yet connected to the greater tapestry of galactic consciousness. Master Yalen had long since transcended the normal lifespan of his species, sustained not by artificial means but by the pure joy he found in witnessing the endless creativity of consciousness learning to know itself. His teachings had evolved far beyond the traditional boundaries of Jedi philosophy, encompassing insights that drew from every tradition of Force use while being limited by none of them. The schools he had founded operated on principles that would have seemed impossible in the galaxy's earlier days. Students learned not by memorizing established doctrines, but by experiencing directly the living truth that flowed through all things. They practiced not predetermined forms but movements that emerged spontaneously from their own deepest understanding. They studied not to accumulate knowledge, but to become vessels through which wisdom could flow freely into the world. Yalen's greatest joy came from observing how his students inevitably surpassed him, not by rejecting his teachings but by integrating them so completely that they became starting points for explorations that led into territories he had never imagined. Each generation built upon the insights of the previous one, while remaining true to the fundamental principle that consciousness could never be fully captured in any system of thought, no matter how sophisticated or comprehensive. Zara's wanderings had taken her to the far edges of galactic space and beyond, into regions where reality itself operated according to different principles than those that governed more familiar territories. She had become something more than a mere traveler, evolving into a living bridge between different forms of consciousness that might otherwise have remained forever isolated from each other. Her ship had grown with her, developing into a quasi-living entity that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that had no names in any known language. It served not just as a means of transportation, but as a mobile embassy that could facilitate communication between forms of awareness so different that they might otherwise be unable to recognize each other's existence. Through her efforts, the galaxy had discovered that it was not alone in the universe, that consciousness had evolved independently in countless other regions of space and time. Each of these distant civilizations had developed its own relationship with the fundamental forces that shaped reality, creating technologies and philosophies that expanded the very definition of what was possible. Yet, for all the wonders she had encountered in her travels, Zara found her greatest satisfaction in the quiet moments when she could return to familiar space and witness the gentle transformation that continued to unfold throughout the world she had helped to awaken. The changes were often so subtle that they might escape casual observation, but to eyes trained by decades of careful attention, they were as obvious as the turning of seasons. Children born after the Great Convergence grew up with an intuitive understanding of their reality's constructed nature, but this knowledge did not burden them with cynicism or despair. Instead, it filled them with appreciation for the artistry involved in creating a universe complex enough to sustain infinite forms of beauty and meaning. They played games that involved conscious creation of pocket realities, learned mathematics by exploring the geometric structures that underlay dimensional space, and developed empathy by temporarily sharing consciousness with beings whose forms of existence were completely unlike their own. The arts had undergone transformations that made earlier forms of creative expression seem primitive by comparison, though the older works were treasured not as relics but as foundations upon which new forms of beauty could be built. Musicians composed symphonies that existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions, creating harmonies that could be perceived by forms of consciousness that had evolved along entirely different trajectories. Painters worked with pigments made from crystallized emotions, producing works that transmitted their creators' insights directly to the awareness of those who contemplated them. Writers developed narrative forms that adapted themselves to the consciousness of each reader, telling the same story in infinite variations that honored both the universal themes that connected all beings and the unique perspectives that made each individual's experience valuable. These stories were not consumed passively, but became collaborative creations, with each reader contributing their own understanding to the ongoing evolution of the narrative. The galaxy had learned to dream collectively while still honoring the value of individual consciousness, creating a form of shared existence that was neither the artificial unity imposed by the ancient manipulators, nor the chaotic fragmentation that had threatened to emerge during the early stages of awakening. It was a harmony that emerged naturally from the interactions of beings who had learned to see themselves as both separate individuals and aspects of a greater consciousness that encompassed all possible forms of awareness. In the crystal gardens of Orsus, as the three old friends shared memories of their long journey through the mysteries of existence, they could feel the presence of countless other beings across the galaxy who were engaged in their own explorations of consciousness and reality. Each world had become a unique experiment in the possibilities of aware existence, yet all were connected by the flowing currents of understanding that linked every thinking being in a web of mutual support and shared wonder. The stars themselves seemed to pulse with gentle rhythms that spoke of vast processes of cosmic evolution, changes so gradual that they could only be perceived across spans of time that dwarfed individual lifetimes, yet so profound that they transformed the very nature of what it meant to exist. The galaxy was growing up, learning to see itself not as a collection of separate worlds but as a single organism in which every part contributed to the health and wisdom of the whole. As night fell over Osuz and the crystal formations began to glow with soft light that came from within rather than from any external source, the three companions settled into meditation that was also communion, their individual consciousnesses merging temporarily with the greater awareness that flowed through all things while still maintaining the unique perspectives that made their friendship possible. In that peaceful joining, they could perceive the endless dance of consciousness, exploring its own infinite nature, creating realities and transcending them, manifesting forms and dissolving them, always moving toward greater understanding and deeper appreciation of the mystery that it was to itself. It was a dance without beginning or end, a song without words that expressed the deepest truth of existence, that awareness itself was the fundamental reality from which all other realities emerged and to which they would eventually return, enriched by the experiences they had gathered during their temporary manifestation as separate forms. The galaxy slept peacefully under stars that watched over it with the wisdom of ages, carrying dreams of infinite possibility through the cosmic night toward dawns that would bring new opportunities for consciousness to discover ever deeper aspects of its own boundless nature.